Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this afternoon's flash briefing on navigating the seas of ransomware to cyber safety. I'm Alan Calder, I'm your host for the afternoon. We're going to be talking today about a range of issues. As the slides advance, we are a company that has been dealing for about 15 years with challenges around cybersecurity, risk compliance. We've delivered large volumes of training and consultancy projects through all of the companies that make up the GRC International Group. IT governance in the UK, EU and the US is our main brand and the one-stop shop for everything to do with cybersecurity and privacy. I'm joined by two colleagues who have huge competence and skills in the area of cybersecurity this afternoon. So our panelists for today, apart from me on the left there, are James Pickard, who's our security testing manager. James will be talking briefly about the anatomy of a cyber attack, and Cliff Martin, who leads our cyber incident response capability, and he'll be talking in some detail about cyber incident response. Our agenda for today is going to deal with a number of issues around cyber security. So we're going to be looking at, just moving on to the next slide, an overview of the rapid rise of ransomware attacks, the anatomy and how to prepare for and protect yourself from an attack. We're going to look at specifically the Colonial Pipeline and the Irish Health Service attacks, how they came to fall victim to those and what those look like. We're going to have then a final look at the ICO's ransomware and incident response guidance and what that might mean for your organization, and a look at some of the ways in which you can take steps to protect yourself. All in all, this is a approximately 20-minute session. We're going to run very rapidly through the subject matter, and then there's open forum for questions and answers at the end of our presentation. So the figures you're looking at, the kind of background context for today: 61% of organizations have been hit by a ransomware attack in the last 12 months. 31% of organizations have a business continuity plan that covers cybersecurity, which means that 69% of organizations are sitting ducks for serious organized crime. 48% rise in threat volume in the first year of the pandemic, as cyber criminals in particular took advantage of the shift to home working, the reduction in perimeter security that brought about, and the opportunities which that gave them. Because in fact, only 25% of businesses have a cybersecurity policy that covers home working. 75% of businesses that shifted to home working tend to have, therefore, big opportunities for cyber criminals, and ransomware has become the threat of choice for cyber criminals. So there you are, that's the context. Let's take a bit of a look at what an attack actually looks like. James.
Yeah, so today I'm just going to do a brief overview of what the general steps are involved within a cyber attack, or a ransomware attack, even more. So first of all, the attackers need to identify their targets. The majority of ransomware attacks are untargeted. They cast their net wide because they want to get as many people as possible. However, they can turn into target attacks where they target for more money, or they analyze their targets in that size. So they can target this on sector or client size because they may get bigger payouts at this rate. The next stage would be the weaponization. So they can gather their information through so the dark web, where they've leaked from previous attacks through WikiLeaks or through targeted enumeration. So that's how they build their target lists up. The next step for them is weaponization. So this is where they design the payload which will execute onto the user machine. This can be done by free tools online. They can develop code themselves, but that involves a lot more investment of time, or they can use a paid-for subscription service, which is proven to work at the time that they subscribe to it. So the next stage is how do they deliver this to their victims? So the most common one is phishing. They create an email which is generic but relevant to most organizations. This can be targeting people like the finance department, sales teams, around, for example, invoicing, which will lead to them downloading potential file onto their laptop or machine. Other options that they can do it is through file uploads on websites, common vulnerabilities which are known, or new vulnerabilities that are just out and people haven't got around to patching them, and also links within emails as well. So once they've delivered this and it's been executed on the machine, the user generally has to click on the link or the malware to run it. There is some automation which can run automatically, but generally the user does have to action this. Once actioned, the payload often communicates back to a control and command center. This is where either the attacker can communicate between the hosts, or it's automated and it sends the encryption keys across to them. So at this stage, you've got to be aware that it may not only just deploy ransomware, it may have another goal in mind, such as data exfiltration. So there could be other components at this stage which get introduced. Then we go on to the replication. So for it to take effect across a business and really affect themselves, they have to compromise multiple hosts or multiple data areas. So they often move through the network using things like weak permissions. This could be local admins that have reused passwords, overly permissive accounts which they compromised on that host. They can also upload files to file shares which are accessed by different users within the organization, or they could spread through exploits that are available within the local network. Once the attackers are happy with the replication, they can finally go to the last stage of this, which is the encryption. So they encrypt the data at this point, and they often leave a note to say that they have been encrypted, and with the demands that they need to make to unencrypt the data. So essentially this moves on to their payday, which is often cryptocurrencies. So they often want paying within cryptocurrencies because this is like an anonymous way of transferring money that can't be tracked. But if you do choose to pay them, you do have to be careful because they don't always release the encryption keys, or they don't have the capability to decrypt your files. So it's important that you're aware of this. But for them to get paydays, if they aren't releasing their files, people won't pay as well. So there's two sides to this. So I'm going to pass over to Cliff now, which is going to talk about the protection side of things.
Good afternoon, everybody. So just before I get into the two case studies, I just gonna have a quick chat regarding preparing for a cyber incident. Obviously, that we all understand that this is a problem area that the organisations need to start thinking about. So, what does that actually mean in terms of your organisation? So, when preparing for an incident, we need to make sure that we have the capability to identify, contain, eradicate, and recover from a cyber incident. And that term in itself, cyber incident, means different things to different people. So, part of your planning for a cyber incident should be to define what you mean by a cyber incident, because it could be that you're having an incident, or you're having a cybersecurity event, or it's just a general vulnerability that needs to be mitigated at some point in the future. So for an organisation, you first need to define what you're going to do in the event of a cyber incident. So if your organisation was to have a ransomware attack tomorrow, for example, does the relevant people know what they need to do? Who is responsible? Who has that accountability, and who has that authorization to make those difficult decisions? So in the case, in the two case studies that we'll talk about in just a minute, you know, both operations were shut down for a length of time, which had significant impacts on both organizations from financial, reputational aspect. You know, the people within the cyber incident team, do they have the authorization to make those difficult decisions, or do they need to then spend time trying to locate the right people? And this is an area that we do see time and time again, that you're spending more time looking for those people. So in terms of a cybersecurity incident plan, it needs to consider the people, the process, the technology, and the physical aspects of what the organization will do in respect to an incident. Now, this includes, you know, having the defined roles, responsibilities, and those dependencies where applicable. It also means that your cyber incident response team must be trained to do what is expected of them, and they have been exercised in terms of what that plan actually means. So what's recommended in most standards is that this is done on at least a 6-monthly basis, where you're running through an example of an incident and trying to determine what your organization would do if that was to happen to you. Now, what I mean by process, so I've mentioned the plan, and we've also got something referred to as playbook. So this is looking at individual attacks and then defining, well, what would you do in that case? So the plan would be your top level document, which would sit above all, and then your playbooks would be the specific details underneath to say, well, how am I going to react to a ransomware versus an insider threat versus a phishing attack? You know, some of that might be similar, but there will be slight differences in how your organization responds to those. Now, in terms of technology, we'll go a little bit more into the technology when we talk about mitigations, especially when we talk about the 2 case studies. But this includes things like endpoint protection, the EDR systems, your event viewing, logging, monitoring. If your organization has a SOC, for example, it's all around how we get that information to the appropriate people, and if it's applicable and relevant to the incident, it's in progress, hopefully. And then the last one there is physical controls, and this is the one that most people sort of think, really? But this can include things like CCTV. It can include access management into specific areas of your organization. Do you know who's going in and out of your organization? Is there a way to track that from a physical perspective? Now, the 2 cases that we'll talk about in just a second, they were based from a remote location, but physical controls, especially when dealing with insider threats or people gaining physical access into the environment, needs to be considered as part of this incident response capability. So I'll move on to the first case study, which is the Colonial Pipeline attack. So, as most people know on the call, on the 7th of May, there was a significant cyber incident that happened on the Colonial Pipeline IT network, which basically crippled their whole operation. Now, luckily, this attack didn't impact their operational technology from a cyber perspective, but as you start to look into it, you'll realize that just because the IT network was compromised, it did have a significant impact on the operational side in terms of how they did business, because they basically had to shut down everything. So it was a couple of days, which would have cost them lots and lots of money. But as part of that, because it did have such a significant impact on the states, the government at the time did issue the emergency legislation at the time. And I'm sure everybody's seen who's on the call, just the pictures of the panic and confusion that was happening at the time, especially in the States, where you have people going to the gas station and just filling up any type of container they could find. Now, it's those sort of things that people generally don't think about when it comes to what's the impact of cyber incident. Now, in terms of this one, so there isn't a lot that's come from the incident in terms of what's been going on. Now, there has been a lot of work that's been happening. I know FireEye has been involved, and the FBI and various other organisations. But in terms of this attack, this was based on the dark side ransomware attack, which is the ransomware as a service. And what that basically means is that you have your developer who's responsible for developing the ransomware, they're responsible for maintaining and selling that product to what we refer to as affiliates. Now, the affiliates are the people that actually use it, and they're the people that compromise the victim in this instance, so the Colonial Pipeline expertise system, for this example. But what was interesting about this case is they did take the precautions as they were going through, and in similar types of attacks where they did take precautions in trying to attack the environment and trying to stay as quiet as possible during that time before they deployed the ransomware. And some of the examples that they used was, you know, command and control over the Tor network, so the onion router. Also avoiding endpoint detection and response systems. So the attackers in this instance and those that have been using DarkSide have actually been looking out to ensure that they're not interacting with EDR systems when it comes to the victim systems, because they are devices that will likely notify the organization that they are under attack. Also mechanisms, so the obfuscation techniques that they use throughout the attack to ensure that if anyone did discover it, it just looked like garbage, and that the incident responders found it difficult to react in terms of this attack. And then the last one, just from a stealth perspective, is they took a lot of time in terms of the anti-forensics in this case, and that was a case of the deleted event logs, the deleted backups, they deleted shadow copies, all the sort of things that organizations should have in place, but they just weren't protected. The attackers were able to gain access to the network and then delete them, which caused a whole host of issues when it comes to responding to incidents. Now, in terms of how DarkSide work and their affiliates, as James mentioned before, there's what we refer to as the cyber kill chain. So it's a procedure, a process that an attacker will go through in order to compromise the system. Now, as a defender, we can use the same attack structure and methodology, and we can say, right, what are we going to do at certain points of the kill chain, for example? Where is the opportunities for us to be able to detect that something is happening? Now, this could be something that the Colonial Pipeline missed. You know, we don't know, because right now we don't know how long the attackers were on the IT network. It could have been days, it could have been months, it could have been years. You know, it's not uncommon for an attacker to be on a victim's network for 3+ years just doing what they need to do, and that's a very long time. So in terms of this attack, the initial compromise include things like the phishing and the providing of malicious links. There was also the aspect where they use compromised passwords in terms of the devices that are used from a network boundary perspective. And that's a problem in itself, is the reuse of passwords across multiple systems. Now, moving on, so we've also got the established foothold. So as I mentioned, they use the the command and control system through the Tor network, which provided a whole host of problems, especially when trying to detect that this attack was ongoing. We've also got the use of Cobalt Strike, which is a security testing tool which can be used for command and control, but also lateral movement across the victim network. As we move on, so other signs that we've seen, so the escalating privileges was the exploitation of applications and services, where they looked at specific vulnerable services within the network, and that they were able to use those vulnerabilities to escalate privileges so that they were at higher privilege within the network, so that they were able to then deploy their ransomware. And there's lots of different examples of where where the attacker can use these tools to try and compromise a network. And other tools include like Mimecast and process memory dumps. when the attacker was on the network, they obviously had to be able to scope out and find out what devices were there and what existed. You know, so this is where they had to do their internal reconnaissance, and this is a time when there's a lot of network traffic which could have been detected by the defenders. You know, it's not uncommon for an attacker to use, you know, internal native Windows commands like net command, net use, those sort of things. And then last one, so obviously the big one on this was that the attackers, once they had managed to achieve their objective and that they had a good understanding of what existed, they were then able to deploy their ransomware. And as James mentioned before, that the objective of this attack was actually a double extortion ransomware. They were able to pull off quite a lot of information, which then they were able to use as part of the ransom against the Colonial network. Right, so I'll move on to the next one. So in a similar breath to what I've just mentioned, so the Island Health Service Executive, a similar concept in terms of the ransomware and the double extortion ransomware that was being used. What was interesting about this one is it seemed to be part of a bigger campaign that was happening in Ireland's healthcare service. Because the night before, the Department of Health Services actually identified that they were under attack, and by collaboration with NCSC, they were able to stop and mitigate all the attack before any significant damage. Unfortunately, the HSA were not so lucky, and that their network was completely, the majority of the network was completely locked out. So hence why they had to close their operations as part of the precaution to make sure that it didn't affect their sort of systems. Now, one of the examples we could use is the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency, which were attacked using the same ransomware just before Christmas in December, where they spent nearly £800,000 just in the process in order to get back up and running. £458,000 of that was just in the cost to get their IT operations back up and running, which is a significant amount of money that's part of this. And that doesn't include any ransom, which they didn't actually pay in this case. And all their data was actually released to the public, which would have had significant impact in terms of the reputation of the organisation, which we're going to see as part of this island one as well. So, sorry, just running out of time. I'm just going to pass it back to, oh, sorry, I've got one more slide and then it's on, sorry. So what can we do about this? I'm not going to go into too much detail about each of these. You can see on the screen, there's a lot of controls that can be put in place. The only thing that I would recommend is that you use this and you take a risk-based approach when determining what controls are required. You know, because each of these boxes mean different things for different environments. You know, yeah, take firewalls, for example. Are you going to have a firewall just at the boundary of your network, or is it going to be internally? You know, it's those sort of things you need to consider. Your organisation needs to understand whether it's been compromised. You know, just asking the question now, would you know? You know, well, that's back at all. Thank you.
Thank you, Cliff. So who would have thought that the ICO in the UK or the Data Protection Commissioner in Ireland or the Supervisory Authority for GDPR in any other country would be interested in cybercrime? Well, they are. The ICO at her 2021 conference said that they're going to issue guidance to organizations on how to prepare for cyber attacks, the requirements around data protection and incident response plans in that context, what kinds of notifications should be made when there is a breach, and how data controllers and by extension data processors should go about complying with GDPR. And the key thing that she said is that in any instance where you're reporting a breach as a result of a ransomware incident, you will be investigated for a breach of compliance with GDPR. You should treat that as a basic step that will happen anytime you report a breach which involves ransomware. Because from the ICO's point of view, by definition, the fact that you had a successful ransomware attack means that you didn't take adequate steps to protect the personal data that you're processing. So the risk factors that the ICO, and by extension all supervisory authorities across Europe, will consider is what steps you took to prevent criminal and malicious access to data, how you determined protections against data exfiltration, because that demonstrates loss of control over the data, what kind of detriment there will be to individuals, not just in terms of breaches of confidentiality, integrity, but also unavailability. You can't have a medical operation that you have booked for that's a detriment to the individual as a result of the cyber attack. Known attacker threats, the speed of access of the organization and availability of personal data to the authorized users inside the organization, and the extent to which the organization has suffered permanent loss of the personal data, and the loss of right of access, the loss of confidentiality. Those will all be taken into account in determining what kind of fine should be levied against the organization. So, given that it's not just a major reputational damage, it's a big impact in terms of regulatory life, there are a number of steps that every organization should be taking right now to deal with the exposure. You should, Cliff's outlined a number of the items, but if you're looking for services that help you deal with that, you should be training people. So on the right-hand side, 2 staff awareness courses delivered online around ransomware and around phishing, which you should run and run repeatedly. Evidence indicates that people don't learn from a first running. You have to repeat the message multiple times. There are services you can buy. You can buy incident response service, which will help you prepare for and recover from an attack if one happens. There's cybersecurity as a service, which can take the worries away from you. And of course, there is testing. You should be testing across all of your internet-facing and internal applications. For that matter, you should be testing the network infrastructure, web applications. You should be testing remote compromise for remote compromises that attackers can carry out. You should be doing simulated phishing attacks to determine whether or not people are susceptible to neatly crafted phishing emails. So there are a bunch of things that you should be doing, all of them, of course, through IT governance we can supply you with. And there on screen, you see our contact details in the UK, in Europe, and in the US. And you get access to all of our services we deliver online. So wherever you are in the world, we can deliver to you online effectively, staff awareness training, incident response service, testing services, the battery of services that you need to help you deal with a threat as severe and as evident as is ransomware. And I hope that no organization suffers a ransomware attack through lack of preparation. So, ladies and gentlemen, a bit later than we planned to, but there's a couple of minutes left over for questions. So if you have any, please do either type them into the chat function, in which case I'll pick them up, or just take yourself off mute and ask the question. Do I know what percentage of companies pay out? It's not a publicly available number. Our estimation is that it's somewhere between 60 and 70% of companies pay out. There is hard evidence of the cost of trying to recover when you have inadequate defenses, when your backups are themselves infested with ransomware. All of those kinds of areas have huge problems in terms of recovering. So you haven't prepared. Often organizations decide to simply pay the ransom. It's cheaper, they think. And in most countries, it's not yet illegal to pay ransoms, which means that insurers will tend to cover the cost, and it's less expensive for insurers to cover the cost. However, there is movement against paying ransoms. And so even if your insurance covers it, the reputational damage and the fact that we're moving into an environment where paying ransoms to cyber criminals becomes as illegal as it is for kidnapping people means you need to take action to deal with it. If you need to show a demo of a ransomware, talk to specialists like ourselves. I don't think you want to be yourself deploying ransomware. Remember, it's a piece of criminal software. You get very close to breaking Computer Misuse Acts and so on if you're using it. By ensuring all users do not have local admin rights, how much does that help prevent ransomware? Very significantly. Local admin rights means that if somebody clicks on something, the phishing email that downloads malware will spread very significantly across the network. If they only have limited user rights, then there are limits to what that malware might be able to do. It's a very bad idea to give all users local admin rights simply because of the capability of modern malware to spread right the way across a network. There's not a minimum size of company that's targeted. The hackers will go after anybody who has vulnerabilities. As James said, attacks tend to be focused on vulnerabilities rather than particular targets. You might be a little company. You could still pay a Bitcoin or two. It depends on how valuable your data is. So attackers will go after that. We've touched on recovery cost of an attack, average $2 million. So I think probably we're out of questions as well as being out of time. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. As I said, please don't let yourself be a target. Well, you'll be a target. Please don't let yourself be a victim of a cyber attack. Call us. We certainly can help. Thank you all for your time this afternoon. Bye-bye.